Hello, and a very warm welcome to the launch of State of the Nordic Region 2026. Today, we are going to look at the trends and developments that are shaping regions, municipalities, and cities all across the Nordic region and where we are going into the future. I'm so glad to have you here with us today. My name is Mia Itanen. I'm a senior communications advisor here at Nordic Region. We are streaming to you live today from our offices in Stockholm. And I see that many of you are joining from different parts of the Nordic region and even beyond. So welcome on board. I hope that today will be an active discussion. So I'm happy to see the chat already active from the start. Keep it like that. You can keep using the chat throughout the session. We will pick up some of your questions and comments, and we will also have some questions for you throughout the session. So stay active, keep it up. Before we get going today, we have about an hour and a half reserved to go over some of the highlights of the State of the Nordic Region 2026. But let's have a look at the agenda and give you an overview of what is in store for today. We will start first with a brief introduction, letting you know a little bit about us, about Nordregio, about what we do, about State of the Nordic Region. Some of you might have already seen the report, the prior edition. Some of you might be seeing it now for the first time. So we'll take you through some of the basics and ground rules, and then we will dive straight into the content. We will have 3 content presentations. We will go over some highlights from demography. We will talk about the key developments in labor markets across the Nordic region, and we will talk about the economy and regional economies across the Nordics. And after those 3 topics and themes, we will come back for some reflections and think about what it means for the Nordic region going forward. Before we go into the content more than that, I would also like to know a little bit more about you. We had very high interest for this launch webinar, which we were very happy to see. So I would just like to see who is in the session today. I've just launched a poll, and I would like you to tell me where you are joining us from today. You will find some options in the poll and give us some input, and you can also add more comments in the chat. While you do that, and before I hand over to our colleagues here in the studio to tell you more about the report itself, we are celebrating Nordic Day and Nordic Cooperation this week, and there is a special welcome waiting to be shared with you. So I'm going to open our hotline to Copenhagen, and we will hear from Karen Elleman, the Secretary General of the Nordic Council of Ministers, who will welcome you to this session today. We'll be back after this.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be part of the launch of the 2026 edition of State of the Nordic Region. As we celebrate Nordic Day and Nordic Cooperation this week, it is really a timely moment to take stock of where we are, what we can learn from each other, and also what we can do together. This year's report takes a close look at how our regions are developing in a time of overlapping transitions. We are seeing demographic change, economic restructuring, and a more uncertain geopolitical environment all at once. And these shifts, they affect our regions in very different ways. And why does this matter? Well, because sound decisions depends on a very solid knowledge. And this report brings data, it brings maps, and it brings analysis from across the Nordic region. It really helps us to understand where we stand today, how regions compare, and where risks and opportunities are emerging. So it does not provide simple answers or ready-made solutions, but it really gives you, the policymakers, the researchers and practitioners, it gives you a shared evidence base for dialogue, for planning, and for cooperation across our borders. So I really encourage you to explore this report, use the data and the knowledge, and take part in the conversation about how we shape a resilient, competitive, and socially sustainable Nordic region. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome back. I am here with the two co-editors of the report. To my right, we have Thomas Niedermüsel, our research director here at Nordregio, and Maria Bobrinskaya, our head of GIS, also from Nordregio. As you just heard, this report is essentially a tool for you. We've packed a lot of knowledge into one set of covers, and we hope that you make good use of it. We are very excited to share some of this content with you in just a couple of minutes, but we've had this poll running, and you have already given us a lot of responses there. So thank you for being active. I see a very strong Nordic participation among our audience, and we see some of our key target audiences very well represented. We have local and regional authorities, national governments and ministries, some EU and Nordic representation, as well as academics and researchers and other public agencies, authorities, and such, as well as civil society and private sector representatives. And perhaps even more interestingly, about half of the people who are in the session today have already heard or read previous editions of the State of the Nordic Region, but half of them have not or are not quite sure. So before we go into the content, I think we have to cover some basics and perhaps introduce us a little bit more. And for that, I'm very glad to have both of you here with me for this introductory part. Thomas, for those who might be joining maybe their first ever Nordregio webinar, picking up the State of the Nordic Region for the first time, can you just introduce us a little bit? Who is Nordregio and what do we do?
Okay, sure. Well, Nordregio is an applied research institute that was established by the Nordic Council of Ministers, and we do research on regional development and planning across the Nordics. And being an applied research institute, that actually means that we interact a lot with practitioners, policymakers, and so forth. So that is what we do. And our main themes are, in addition to regional development and urban planning, we also focus on themes such as demography, rural development, and governance.
And that's not all. There's even more than research and projects. And Maria, can you tell us a little bit more about the rest of our activities?
Yeah, we at Nordregio, we also work a lot with statistics, both collecting data and sharing databases as Nordic Statistics, for example. And we also work a lot with geospatial analysis, which gives you our maps and visualizations that I think many people enjoy. At least this is something that I've heard. So we see our role is bringing the data and all these complex insights together from across the Nordic region, making it easier to spot shared challenges or also differences between regions. So we do that through research projects, data tools, or reports like the one that we are launching today. And of course, as Thomas said, we work closely with ministries and policymakers and local stakeholders. So we also try to prove the data in real life. And so all that to make it useful in practice for strategic planning and policymaking and just sharing our experiences.
Yes, working to bridge that gap between research and policy and making insights useful both at the research work, but then also for policymakers. And State of the Nordic Region is an excellent example of that because it basically builds on all of these different spheres of activities. But talking about State of the Nordic Region, what kind of report is that?
Yeah, it's Nordregio's flagship report. We publish it every second year. It covers three key themes: demography, labor market, and economy. And each edition builds on the latest available data from Nordic municipalities and regions. And as we follow the same structure with each edition, we can track change over time. But not only historic comparison is of course relevant and important, because with each edition we of course look into what's most relevant in the current period. So then all the chapters that we write are actually relevant and interesting for us to write and hopefully for readers to explore.
So we start with the big trends on demography, labor market, and economy, but then we also tweak it based on what is relevant and particularly interesting at that moment. But staying still on the topic of State of the Nordic Region as a report, it is kind of a unique report, Thomas. What makes it so special?
Yeah, well, what makes it special is basically that it's a Nordic comparison. That is essentially what makes it unique. And I mean, the Nordic countries are very interesting from a research perspective because we share the same framework. We share similar institutions, so the countries are broadly comparable. And that also has a great value for analytical insights because they mean more when you can actually compare across countries. So in the report, the regional differences we find, they mean something. And I mean, they can be related to geography, demography, or actual policy choices made. And so we try to tap into that.
So something very special coming up soon, and we will continue with the content, but what makes 2026 special? Did something stand out in the process of making this report? And while Maria tells you about what makes 2026 special, we have another poll running, and I would like to know which of these themes is most relevant or most interesting to you. Are you more into demography, perhaps more interested in labor market, or looking into the economy, or perhaps all of these? We will cover all of them very shortly, but 2026, what does it hold?
Yeah, I think the most standing out is the time when we were writing this report. So when we started to discuss what should be the focus of this edition almost a year ago, it was already like the world around us was already a place of like all these growing uncertainties and crises happening everywhere. And I think we were questioning ourselves a lot, like how Nordics stand in this situation, and more importantly, how can we actually analyze and track all these uncertainties and how they impact the Nordic region, because the data that is available to us is not coming out at the same pace as the news cycles. So yeah, I think that's the most outstanding thing, and how actually Nordics do today. We will tell you just a bit, but you should read the report yourself and see Nordics navigating the crisis.
The report is now available. We've shared a link to it with you just before the webinar, so you can have a look at the full content. But just to make the work a little bit easier for you, we will take you through some of the highlights and give you some pointers on where to start looking at those. We had a poll running about your interests, and I think this sets a very good basis for us to get into the content and the discussions, because half of you are interested in all of the topics, which is great, and for the rest it is divided between demography, labor market, and economy. So I don't think we will keep you waiting any longer. It is time to start looking at how the Nordic region is really doing. We will start doing that by looking at demography, and to do that, I will invite our colleague Nora Sanchez-Gassen, one of our senior research fellows, to join us here and tell you more. While Nora is presenting, you can pass questions to her in the chat, and we will come back to those after this presentation. Nora, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mia. And a warm welcome to all of you also from my side. My name is Nora Sanchez-Gassen. I work as a senior research fellow here at Nordic Region, and it's my pleasure to give you some insights into the material we publish in the demography section of the State of the Nordic Region. We've been a whole team of researchers, authors, GIS experts, and we've worked very hard to put together a set of maps, tables, figures for you to give you an overview of where do we stand in the Nordic region when it comes to demography. What are the key challenges? What are the key trends? You do also find maps in there, as I've mentioned, so you can compare the Nordic countries, but you can also look at municipalities and regions. You can see how your municipality or region is doing in comparison to others and where we overall stand. There's a lot of rich material. I can encourage you to have a look. We cover in the State of the Nordic region low fertility, we cover population aging, we cover growth, population growth in the Nordic region and the role of migration in this. And we look also at the rising diversity that we are seeing in our Nordic societies. So a lot of content. Together with the team, I've picked 5 visualizations for you today, and with 5 key highlights that we wanted to share with you. But as I said, there's a lot more visualizations in the report itself, so I can encourage you to look at this and scroll through. But let's have a look at then some of the materials we have picked for you today. Well, we can start by saying that we all know there are certain demographic challenges that are common to the Nordic region, and low fertility is certainly one of them. We know it's been a lot in the media. I'm sure you're all very aware of this, that fertility has declined in all Nordic countries and also the autonomous regions. In some countries, it's even at historically low levels. We've heard some of the countries have put in place expert commissions to look into the causes of low fertility and provide policy recommendations. We'll have to see what comes out of those commission reports. It's also going to be very interesting to compare findings across the Nordic countries. But I think one thing we already know today is that the causes of low fertility are probably quite complex and therefore also difficult to address with single policies. We also know that low fertility is not a Nordic phenomenon. This is shared by other European countries and countries around the world where fertility is low or declining. So it's likely a very complex situation we're in. What is easier for us sort of to pinpoint and to look at and to deal with is the consequences of low fertility, of course. And there I see a key role for the municipalities and regions to plan, to adjust, to adapt to a situation where we have smaller cohorts of children being born. This is a key role, I think, for the regions and the municipalities. And here we can be a bit surer. Here we have projections to give us a glimpse, to give us an idea of what we're dealing with. On the map that you see here, we made one map for you. We collected information on fertility at local and regional levels to give you an idea. If you look carefully at the map, you will see there's just a few municipalities with a very dark brown color. These are the only municipalities in the Nordic region which reach a fertility level at or above 2.1 children for women. And this level, 2.1 children per women, this is usually mentioned by demographers at the level that is required for every generation to reproduce itself, so that we keep a population stable. You see, if you look carefully on the map, there's only very few municipalities that are at or above this level. The vast majority of municipalities, it is below that or sometimes even far below that. So this is data we have. This is the situation we sort of have data on and that we can hopefully in the best way plan for and prepare. Another challenge that is shared by the Nordic region, or another development we can say that is shared by the Nordic region, is population aging. We have one map here for you in the state of the Nordic region to look at that in more detail. Here we chose to look at the oldest age group in our societies, those who are 80 years and older, the 80 plus population. And we wanted to see how is this population group expected to develop between today and 2045. So looking approximately at 20 years in time. What we basically did in this map is we looked at every municipality and region into the data, how many people in this 80 plus age group live there today. And then we looked at the projections which we have from our statistical offices, and we tried to see how does that number look like in 2045? How many people are we expected to have in this oldest age group then? And on the map, we've plotted the change for you, the change over those 20 years. And you can see this is a very harmonious map, all in one color, different shades of blue. This is because the trend is going in the same direction everywhere. It's going up, as you may imagine. There's one partial exception here. It's a municipality called Tjökar on the islands of on the Åland Islands. Here in that one municipality, if we compare the data today and in 2045, the number of people in this age group is almost stable. I think it's a 1% difference. But everywhere else we see an increase, sometimes stronger, sometimes less strong, but an increase. Now, you may say that perhaps that is not extremely surprising. We all know that population aging is happening, right? So if I would not have shown you this map and I would have asked you what you think the trend is, I guess most of you would have guessed this, that the numbers are going up. But nonetheless, we at Nordregio thought this was a rather striking map because we have more than 1,000 municipalities in the Nordic region. And we thought it was rather striking that this trend of increasing numbers of people in this age group, that we see it everywhere, urban, rural, in the middle, everywhere. So this is, I think, a key takeaway that we have from this work with this map. And of course, it has policy implications, right? We know in the Nordic countries, it's the municipalities that are supposed to provide elderly care In Finland, it has been transferred to the welfare regions, but regions and municipalities, they are responsible. So if we see here this rising number of older adults, we also know, according to statistics, the Nordic health and welfare statistics, that care needs really increase after age 80. Of course, some people need care before they turn 80, but overall in the data, we see that increases in care needs that happens after age 80. So if we see now these increases in this age group, I think we can anticipate increasing care needs, and that basically everywhere. This, of course, is also then a really good opportunity, we think, for Nordic collaboration. The questions or the discussions we are having now, how to attract staff into elderly care, how to retain them there, how to make work in this sector more attractive, all these discussions we're already having now, I think they will become perhaps even more important in the future. And also, we have to focus more on this and perhaps even become more ambitious if you look at the map here. And of course, there's a lot of good potential for Nordic collaboration, since this is a shared development. So to learn from each other, exchange knowledge, discuss about which policies have worked, have not worked, how we can potentially work together to provide the care. All of this, I think, are good opportunities for us in the Nordic collaboration. Finally, I want to end with maybe a more positive look on this map. When we talk about population aging, I think very often we frown our foreheads and we scratch our heads and look at this as a big challenge that we need to address and tackle. But we should never forget that this is also an achievement and a privilege for the Nordic region to have so many people reach these old ages, something that previous generations did not have. I think it's something to be proud of. It's an achievement of the Nordic welfare systems. So something to keep in the back of our head. We would probably not want to have it any other way. Even though, of course, the regions and the municipalities have work to do here. When we talk about all the demographic challenges, we like to look at demographic challenges, but I think one thing we almost tend to forget sometimes is that the Nordic region is actually a growing region when it comes to population. This, I hope you can see nicely here on the figure. If you look at the yellow bars there in front of you, you will see that there's a steady but slow increase in population size. So each of the bars represents the population size in 1 year between 1990 and 2024. And overall, we can say that the population living in the Nordic region has increased from 23 million in 1990 to 28 million more recently, a steady but slow increase. And I can say that this is also expected to continue in the future if we look at the projections. However, and this is one small qualification, it depends on migration. And this you can also already see a bit here in the map, or in the figure. If you look at the blue line here on the figure, that is net migration. So here we are comparing the number of people who move to the Nordic region and the number of people who move away. In the past, that number has always been positive. So more people have come to the Nordic region than moved away. And we can say that that has contributed quite substantially to population growth. You see in the blue curves that are up and downs. During the pandemic, for example, there was quite a big dip. And also in the last years, you can see, at least on the net level, migration has gone down, but still it's positive and contributing to population change. If we look at natural population change, on the other hand, and that is the red line that you see on the figure, if we look at that, that's a different story. When we talk about natural population change, we're comparing births and deaths in the Nordic region. And if you look closely towards the end of the figure, the last couple of years, you see that number really has gone down. It's hovering around 0 now. Has even been negative in a few years. That means we have more or less the same number of births and deaths in the Nordic region at the moment. And that is also expected to continue in the future, at least for the Nordic region as a whole. We might even have somewhat more deaths than births for the Nordic region as a whole. So not much growth can be expected on that side. And if more growth is supposed to happen in the future, we can really say migration plays a strong role here. But of course, we all know it, there's strong variation within the Nordic region. It's variation between countries, variations between municipalities and regions, and you will also find material on that in the State of the Nordic Region. If we can compare countries, for example, we see on one end of the spectrum Iceland, which has already had quite substantial increase in the past. And if we look into the future until 2045, what the projection from Iceland says is that a growth of 38% is expected until 2045. So quite a massive increase coming both from migration, but also from natural population change, because in Iceland, there is a projection for more deaths than births. So this, in a sense, strong growth. It's a continuation of what we've seen in the past, because also in the last years, the population has grown quite strongly there. On the other hand of the spectrum, we have Greenland, where until 2045, the population is expected to decline by 15%. This is mainly coming from out-migration, because also on Greenland, we have more births than deaths. But too many people are moving away, and overall, this leads to population decline, at least according to the projections that we have at the moment. The other Nordic countries fall somewhere in between those two extremes. And on the map that I put here, you can also see what happens at local and regional level in this same time period between today and 2045. Areas that you see in blue there on the map, these are areas that are expected to have population increase until 2045. Areas that you see here highlighted in orange are areas where population decline is expected. And I think we see very familiar patterns that we already got used to from the past. A lot of the growth is expected to happen in urban areas. A lot of the decline is concentrated in more rural or remote areas. So this trend that we've been seeing all the last years and decades of an increasing urbanization where more people live in cities, it looks, at least according to our current projections, as that is going to continue. There are exceptions, of course. We do see some municipalities in rural areas that are thriving and have growing populations. These are often places that benefit from tourism, for example, or are close to a city. But overall, this urban-rural divide that we've had in the past seems to persist also in the future. And of course, also this is something that both the cities and the more rural areas have to adapt and plan for. Finally, I mentioned the important role of migration for our populations, for population growth. And we have one chapter, very interesting, in the State of the Nordic Region that looks at immigrants and the immigrant population in the Nordic countries, also including where people are actually coming from. And I encourage you to have a look at that chapter. We have figures in there for every single Nordic country, but here I put the figure for you for the entire Nordic region, so you can look at how it looks for our region as a whole. What you see here is visualizing the immigrant population living in the Nordic region. And you see that we have picked 4 years, 4 points in time. The size of this figure indicates to you the size of the immigrant population. So you can see really how it has grown over the last decades. You see there's different colors in there as well. These show you the world regions where people come from. And if you look in 2024, perhaps you can see it if it's not too small. On top of the figure, yellow, these are immigrants, the strongest group we have in the Nordic countries, the largest group coming from the EU 27. So it's immigrants in the Nordic region who are coming from EU countries, not outside the Nordics, we're excluding the Nordics here, but outside the Nordics. So EU, intra-EU migration coupled to the freedom of movement. Just below that, another European group, in red, you see them there, the second largest group of immigrants in the Nordics. Europeans from outside the EU, that would, for example, include Ukraine, but also some of the Balkan countries. Second largest group. And only after that, you can see there's quite a range of other world regions represented in the Nordics, from Asia to Africa to the Americas and so on. So a couple of takeaways perhaps from this figure. We have more immigrants, we can see it quite clearly. The immigrant population is getting also more diverse in the Nordic region. But I think to me, it was interesting to see that the Europeans come out so strong on top, because we know it in the public discussion, in the media, a focus is very much on the immigration and integration of third country nationals, those coming from outside the EU. But if you look at the data, you actually can see that the Europeans are really the main group, at least in the Nordic region considered as a whole. So to wrap up, demography is destiny. Perhaps you've come across this saying. It's sometimes said just to underline how important demography is. It affects so many aspects of our lives. It has impacts on the labor markets. It can affect sometimes the economy, housing, transport. There's so many areas that are affected by how populations are developing. But of course, demography doesn't just happen to us. We can, at least to some extent, try to influence demographic trends. But most importantly, at regional and local level, we can try to adapt, we can try to plan, and we can try to sort of create the best conditions locally and regionally for the population development that we have and that is anticipated. And here we really hope that the State of the Nordic Region can help you and can make a contribution. So you have the data, you have some projections, you have some material and some facts that you can look at and that can hopefully inform your decision-making and the processes locally and regionally. To summarize, I mentioned a couple of the trends we're seeing that are important to keep in mind. Fertility rates, which are below replacement, and I think likely going to remain that way. Aging with more people in the 80+ population and probably increasing care needs coming up to us. We have population growth that is also expected to continue, provided we have immigration to the Nordic region and the rural-urban divides that we are used to, urban growth, rural decline, which causes, of course, planning tasks for both sides. Overall, we can stress that many of these trends are really shared Nordic trends. They are something we have in common. So we think there's really excellent opportunities here for Nordic collaboration and knowledge exchange and to look for good solutions together. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Nora. It definitely shows that demography is one of the shared challenges, perhaps one of the shared opportunities as well. So something for us to keep working on together. We have had very attentive audience and active chat. Thank you for that. Maria, how is it looking on the chat side? Do we have some questions for Nora?
We do quite a bunch of questions. Some of them Nora already have answered, I think, with her presentation, but we can touch upon one or two, I think. For example, we got a question about the map showing the projected population 80 plus, why Sweden looks so outstanding on this map, why the color is so much lighter, meaning that the population, the share of 80 plus is lower. Any comments on that?
That is a very good question, which also struck me when I looked at this. I don't have a perfect answer now, I have to be honest. I think it doesn't mean that we have less people in the 80 plus age group. It just doesn't mean that the increase maybe perhaps not be as strong as elsewhere. I would have to look into the exact age composition of those municipalities to be able to give a really good answer. But I think it can depend on, for example, if you have small municipalities where there are already a lot of old people, 80 plus, living now, then maybe the potentials for further increase are not as high as if you have one of the major urban centers, for example, Stockholm City, where you have a lot of young students. The potential for aging is also a lot higher. I think this may be part of it. But we can say that in overall, these projections of 80 plus, of the 80 plus population, they are quite good, simply because these people are already living, right? Those who are 80 plus in the future, well, that's our 60 plus population now, right? They're already there. Some of them will die. Some of them may move away, but we also know that the older you get, perhaps the less likely you are to move abroad and start a completely new adventure. So we know who these people are. I have to admit, I would have to look more particularly into the north of Sweden and what's happening there. But I suspect it has something to do with the existing age structure and that they already have a rather old population.
Thank you, Nora. We do have time for a couple more questions, so we will pick up a few, but I also saw that there was a lot of interest in these maps. And I just want to let you know that we have shared the link to the report itself, as well as our map gallery, where all of the maps, not just the ones that we are presenting today, but all of the maps that are available in the report are available. So you can go and zoom in and have a look at your own municipality, maybe your own neighbors, and see exactly how you compare at the Nordic level. That being said, Maria, let's take another question.
Great. We had a couple of questions that touch upon the migration rates and low fertility rates, asking like how, to what extent migration compensates the declining fertility. And I think that you explained that a bit in your presentation, but maybe you can add some more thoughts. And another question that is in the same field is, what are the primary reasons for Nordic population to decline, Nordic born, and how do they coexist, the migration rates and fertility decline?
Yes, so if we look at the projections, for example, you will find a table in one of our chapters where you can see that if we look at the Nordic region as a whole, natural population increase until 2045 is expected to be slightly negative. So there's going to be somewhat more deaths than births. So as I tried to say in my presentation, we can't really expect a lot of growth coming from that side, rather perhaps a slight decline, unless something changes and we get unexpected baby booms. But otherwise, I think we can expect that not much growth is coming from this side. But as I try to show also that we have profited from quite high immigration in the Nordic region in the last years and decades. And if that continues, so this in a sense, yes, it really compensates for the lack of birth. Then we have differences, quite a few differences, honestly, across the Nordic region. And I try to highlight Iceland as one example, which has both high immigration and more births than deaths. I think I'm bad with remembering numbers, but I think Norway was in a somewhat similar situation. Finland, for example, on the other hand, we know that the natural population decline is more negative. So here immigration is really needed. So you need to look at the individual countries, perhaps even at the individual municipalities to get a more concrete picture of how it looks like for you. But for the Nordic region as a whole, yes, I think we can say that immigration is needed and it to some extent compensates for the low fertility we have at the moment.
And this also shows how many of the demographic issues are very interlinked, not only within demography, but as we will see later on with some other themes and topics as well.
Let me just add, if I may,
yes.
we can of course also say that migration is not just adding to our population growth because people come here. They may also have children here. And in that sense, sort of this has ripple effects demographically, right? On the other hand, these migrants also get older, so may themselves need care later on. There's a lot of ripple effects that come from these demographic trends, yes.
Exactly, exactly. We will take one more question to Nora, and then the rest of the questions we will save for later. If we have time, we'll come back to them towards the end of the session or cover them elsewhere. But now one last question, Maria, for Nora.
Yeah, I've got one question that I think can be a nice bridge towards our next themes. And it's again about integration of migrants, but how it affects in the long term the Nordic societies and labor markets. Maybe just a few words before we dive into labor market and economies.
If I understood it right, the impact of migration on our societies overall. Yeah, I mean, of course, demographically, we can see it. It contributes to population growth, but to make the best out of migration for the migrants, but also, of course, for the Nordic municipalities, it's of course best if we achieve good integration of those migrants, both in terms of the labor market, absolutely, but also socially, culturally, that they feel welcome here, that they become part of communities. So this is really an area that we, I think, are working on. We have several projects on this also at Nordregio, how we can, for example, facilitate the integration of higher educated migrants to come faster into the labor market, how we work with women, with youth, and all of this. So these are areas, of course, that we also can work together and are good areas for collaboration. But integration is, of course, very important so that people feel included, get included, and don't stay sort of outside of our societies.
Absolutely, a very central issue to pick up later on. Thank you, Nora. We will close the demography part here, but as you heard, the theme really is relevant for the rest of the discussion that will follow. Labor market was already mentioned a couple of times, and that is the topic we are going to dive into next. I will invite another one of our senior research fellows, Anna Lundgren, to come up here and tell you more about what is happening in the Nordic labor market. Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maria. So from demography, we will now move over to the labor market, and I will share with you a few highlights from the labor market chapters. And just as Nora said, this is also a collaborative effort that we have been working with those chapters. So we've been a full team, and I have been responsible for the coordination of that team in the labor market area. And in this presentation, I will highlight a few things that we find worth to remark. So in this report, we will talk about high employment, high productivity, and a diverse labor market, and how they are key elements to sustain the Nordic welfare economies and support regional development across the Nordic territory. And I will share a few slides here that go into both persistent trends that we see, but also some new emerging patterns that we find interesting. So let's start with employment. As you know, high employment is one of the key features of the Nordic region. It's one of the key characteristics that is also sustaining the Nordic welfare model. And as you can see here in the graph, this is the development of the employment rate from 2005 to 2025. You can see that we have had an increase in employment across the Nordic region. And you can also see that all the Nordic countries are performing better than the EU. That is the line in the bottom of the graph. We can also see that some dips in this graph that were connected to the financial crisis in 2008 and to the COVID pandemic. But as you can see, the Nordic region has managed to recover from those crises. However, as Nora also mentioned, in the demography area, we also have differences between different regions and different municipalities. So this presents the overall picture of the Nordic countries, while in the individual countries, we may find strong differences. And that is that some areas, some regions and municipalities and some groups within the labor force are having larger difficulties in finding employment. But a new thing that we see here is that people are working until older ages. And that was something we found quite interesting. And this is, of course, a result of living longer. We heard before about a life expectancy in aging populations from Nora, but it is also a reflection of the changed statutory retirement schemes where we now have a retirement age that are moving upward, reflecting the life expectancy, and also that more people work in higher ages. So people tend more frequently to work until they retire and also after they have retired. And moving over to unemployment and outside the labor market, these are another two key indicators when looking into the labor market area. And also here we find differences between the municipalities and the regions. So the more reddish map shows unemployment and the more purple map shows population outside the labor market. But although we find regional and municipal differences, I think the striking pattern here is the national differences between the countries. And we can also see those national differences when we compare why people are outside the labor market. And that is the graph to the right. And as you can see, education and own illness or disability are the most common reasons for being outside the labor market. But there are also reflected in the research literature that there are multiple barriers, usually being the reasons why people are outside the labor market. Something interesting also with the graph is when you compare to the EU, where you see that family caring is more frequent than as a reason for being outside the labor market compared to the Nordic countries. And this is also reflecting the Nordic welfare model, where we have public support, public measures to help out taking care of young children and taking care of elderly persons. And one may ask oneself why we see those national differences. I should also remark that on the unemployment, you see that the darker the colors are on both maps, the more severe the situation is, can we say. So on the unemployment side, you see that the more darker colors are found in Finland and in Sweden. Whereas when it comes to outside the labor market, you find the more dark colors in Norway and Finland and Greenland, meaning that in those countries, they have higher rates of unemployment and higher rates of people outside the labor force. So one may ask oneself, why do we see those differences between the Nordic countries? Thomas referred here to in the beginning that we have very similar societies, so we could expect to see similar patterns across the Nordic region. And one potential explanation is slightly different ways of measuring, might be one explanation, but we think the larger explanations or the more important explanations come from different incentives, different policies, and we see the effect of these different incentives and policies and whether people are placed as unemployed or as outside the labor market. So altogether, we would say that this indicates that national policies have an impact and a strong influence when it comes to the mismatches on the labor market as how that can be improved. In the second labor market chapter, this section of the labor market consists of 3 different chapters covering slightly different issues. So in the second labor market chapter, we look more into in which sector people work and into their occupations. And as you can see here from the graph, this is a long-term graph going back to the 1960s. You can see this persistent trend that services continue to grow, and employment in services has increased on behalf of industry, agriculture, fisheries, and forestry. And this is a pattern that we see across the Nordic region. And when we talk about the growth in services, that contains both public services and business services, but it is especially business services that have grown over the last period of time. And as you can see in this graph, employment is in the industry sector is declining as a share, but in absolute numbers, employment in industry is still increasing in the Nordic region. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that structural change is an ongoing process. It's necessary sometimes to have those longer time perspectives. But one may also reflect that the discussion that we see currently about reindustrialization cannot yet be seen in the labor market. Another trend that we see across the Nordic region is that more people are working in high-skill occupations. And what you see here is 3 maps. So the more blue map is people working in high-skill occupations. The more reddish map is people working in medium-skill occupations, and the more pinkish map is people working in low-skill occupations. And as you can see, the people that are working in high-skill occupations have been increasing at the expense of people working in medium-skill occupation. And these maps, they shows the change over time from 2014 till 2023. And the high-skill occupations that have been growing in this group, you find managers, professionals, etc. And if we look at this bluish map of the increase of high-skill occupations that we see across the Nordic territory, it's interesting to see that the darker blue areas are not in urban areas or university cities as we used to see, but they are more spread out across the countries. And as you can see from the medium skill occupation, that these are decreasing, while the low skill occupations are stable or just slightly increasing. So why do we see those changing patterns? Why are people working more in high skill occupations today? Well, probably it's an effect of digitalization and automation that has mainly affected people working in medium skill occupations. But it may also be an effect of higher demand for highly skilled people, and also that more people now have a high skilled education. It would be interesting as we go into the future to see what the impact of more AI solutions will be. And there are some indications saying that the high-skilled occupations will also be more affected by the AI and not only the medium-skilled occupations. And this brings us to the question of local labor market vulnerability, which is the 3rd chapter in this labor market section. So while high employment is generally a good thing to reduce local labor market vulnerability, research literature also point to a small gender gap and to high productivity as key factors to reduce vulnerability and to increase labor market resilience. And while economic specialization is generally a good thing, usually resulting in higher wages and higher economic growth, labor markets with a high dependency on a few industry sectors may also be more vulnerable to economic disruptions of different kinds. And based on employment data, we have constructed a sectoral employment concentration index, which is shown here. And this index shows that employment in urban municipalities is more diversified. That means that people work in a larger variety of industry sectors. whereas employment in rural municipalities is often less diversified and more concentrated to a few industry sectors. And employment in intermediate municipalities is in between the two, urban and rural, but as you can see that it's the box in the middle here in more reddish color, you can see it looks more like the urban areas than it does look like the rural areas. However, in the chapter, we also argue that local labor markets with a higher vulnerability due to employment concentration in a few sectors can potentially compensate for this by being part of a larger labor market area. And in the slide here and also in the chapter, you also find this map where you see the sectoral employment concentration in the individual municipalities across the Nordic region. So looking forward, what can we expect from the future? Well, one thing is also referring back to Nora's presentation on demography. It's more likely that we will continue to work in higher ages, and with working life we are more healthy. We have the aging population that we have to work with. We have also a more flexible working life today, which makes it possible. Working remotely is more common, for example. We can also expect more green jobs and more tech jobs, or at least more green tasks and more tech tasks within the jobs that we're conducting currently. And then a more open question with the increasing insecurity that Maria was referring to around the world now. Security and the defense sector is ramping up across the Nordic region, which might potentially create a more diverse job in terms of spatial distribution. We will see jobs coming up in places that were not so common before. Jobs in construction, for instance, but that could also be a potential to open up for young people who have difficulties we have high employment across the Nordic region, I would say, among young people. And it could also be a potential for those with low qualifications, young people and immigrants, for instance, to get a first job and to get into the job market. So that might be a positive side of this otherwise gloomy world that we are now going into. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And please stay with me because we definitely see the impact of demography having its impact on the labor market, but labor market is in transition. And we did get quite a few questions. This is clearly something that people are trying to wrap their head around and look towards the future. So I will turn to Maria for a question or two to Anna.
Yes, maybe before we jump into questions, I want to address a few smaller questions and comments that we got about data availability. Because in this section, we do have some maps where data is not available for some parts of the Nordic region, like for Greenland, Iceland, Åland, or Faroe Islands. Indeed, like we at Regio, to the largest extent, try to select indicators that cover all of the Nordics, but sometimes the data is not available, and then we proceed with what we have. It might be that it's unavailable for the specific timeline. Like, for example, one of the first graphs that Anna shared, Greenland had a very limited presence in this graph. Or it's just not available at all because the countries don't collect it. But diving into questions, maybe Anna, you can share a bit more about the mismatch. We have this quite high employment rates. Very interesting what you shared about high skilled occupations. Any potential issues or maybe some specifics about the jobs mismatch that you can comment on?
Yes, thank you so much, and thanks for the clarification, Maria, about the data availability. When it comes to mismatches on the labor market, yes, indeed, we see a lot, I would say, of mismatches. So on the positive side, we have the high employment rates, which is really something that we should be proud of and should be careful about. But then we also have important challenges when it comes to unemployment and when it comes to those outside the labor market that needs to be worked more in depth with, I would say. But also here we have regional and municipal differences, although, as I mentioned, I think the most striking was the national differences that we saw between the countries. So telling a story of national policies having an impact, a true impact on the skills mismatches on the labor market.
And on the labor market in particular, I think we also see, well, some shared challenges for sure, but clear differences at the national level, as you mentioned, but also within regions. So this is one aspect where the realities locally differ a lot. And on that, we did get already some very nice tips and report suggestions and links in the chat about the demography. If you have additional links to share about your local labor market conditions, please do post those in the chat, because we would be very keen to see some of those and make use of it in our further work. I will take one more question to Anna, and then we will gradually wrap up the labor market part.
Yes, and this question would be any effective ways of integrating the vulnerable groups with low skills into the labor market, or those who are not in the labor market, how to integrate them? Any good examples from across the Nordics with the policies?
Thank you for the question. A very, very good question. I would say in this work with the state of the Nordic region, we have not looked into those concrete examples. However, luckily, with colleagues from Nordregio, I know that we have explored these issues from an employer perspective and from an immigrant perspective, from a senior perspective, from a youth perspective, what can be done to facilitate for those groups that have difficulties of entering the labor market from different perspectives. So there are a number of reports that I'm sure that we can post into the chat to give some ideas what could be done.
Definitely. There's only so much that can be covered within one report, but it's a good thing that we do have more resources available, and we will very gladly make those available too. Keep sending questions if you have some. We will keep them in the chat and pick up your interests and topics for the future. But now that is it with the labor market. Thank you, Anna. We will see if more labor market issues come up in the chat. Now that we've looked at the demography, we see how that sets the basis for development in many ways. We've seen how the labor market is doing, still robust with some challenges and interesting years ahead as we are in a transition. It is time to turn into the economy. For that, I will invite another one of our senior research fellows, Carlos Tapia, to tell you more, and he will share some insights on how the Nordic economy is developing and doing at the moment. Carlos, over to you.
Thank you, Mia, for the introduction. As my former colleagues, I'm also Senior Research Fellow at Nordic, and I have also been coordinating the work in the economy section of the State of the Nordic Region Report 2026 release. As Anna was just saying a minute ago, we live in gloomy times, we live in times of uncertainty, and that is also affecting our economies in various ways. So, in small and open economies, such as those in the Nordic countries, perhaps the best way to look at how a series of shocks that have affected our societies over the last years are actually impacting the economic output is by looking at trade flows. And this is what these two charts do exactly. The one above presents the monthly evolution of exports for the largest Nordic economies compared with the EU average. And the one below does the same for imports. In both cases, the reference value is the average level in year 2019, and the evolution goes until the end of 2025, sorry. So the first of the shocks that I was referring to before was the COVID pandemic, which had a huge impact on aggregated demand, luckily based or thanks to the exceptional contingency measures that were approved by most countries. By year 2022, most of the countries had already recovered the pre-pandemic productivity levels. However, that is the year when the second of these shocks happened, which was the large-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia and all the turmoil that was caused on the energy markets in particular. That had a big impact on cost of living across the Nordic region, and also forced the central banks in most countries to adopt measures to combat inflation that caused a second wave of impacts. The following one, the Gaza war, is not an economic shock as such, but rather caused a huge humanitarian crisis, and it also inaugurated a new way of dealing with international politics that was rather based on force and coercion rather than agreement and international law. And a good example of that approach to international policy was the introduction of the US tariffs unilaterally decided by the US administration under Trump in his second term. That was done roughly 1 year ago and has already important effects on our economies, particularly on sectors and regions that are more exposed to the US market. But it also anticipated further decisions already taking place in 2026, for example, the Greenland sovereignty crisis and the Iran war that we are still suffering today. So then it is really remarkable how overall the Nordic region has behaved so resiliently over this time. Overall, thinking about or considering the evolution of average GDP growth per capita, we see that the change has been around 2% annually in the case of Denmark, 1.5% in Norway and Iceland, roughly a bit lower, 1% in Sweden, and no growth at all, but no decline over a long period in Finland, which is, as I said earlier, a remarkable outcome. So perhaps the reason for this great degree of resilience could be that the matrix of all these shocks is not related to the economies as such. We're not talking about market crashes or financial issues. It's rather external factors, the pandemic or geopolitical tensions affecting our economies, which might be a reason why this behavior has been so resilient. If looking at the regional level, we have tried to understand how those patterns and how those shocks could be leading to different outcomes in terms of growth patterns at the regional level. And what we see is that for the first time, probably since the globalization started in the 1990s, the growth dynamic on growth leadership is not anymore only led by agglomeration economies and the big cities, but rather all the actors, other regions with long industrial bases and a more rural and intermediate characteristics are emerging as being those where growth has been more intense, more dynamic in the last years. So you can grasp that very easily if you look at the Bothnian Basin and compare some Swedish regions like Western Norrland or Finnish regions like Ostrobothnia with the capital cities in both countries, where growth has been lower. It is a bit early, premature to make bold assumptions about these patterns as being something leading to a new normality or new regional growth dynamics, but still it's remarkable how there's new elements emerging thanks or due to the emergence of new economic sectors related to defense, as it was saying, and I was saying before, or the green transition and electrification in particular. So the second aspect that we tried to cover on this report is more related to the degree of vulnerability of exposure of the different regions to these external shocks. And we have done that from the perspective of critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructures are any physical assets that allow our societies to operate with normality. in sectors such as communication infrastructure, energy, and transport networks. The criticality of infrastructures depends essentially on the potential disruptions that might affect them, but also on the backup options that exist in case of something happens. So consequently, the economic relevance of those critical infrastructures needs to be assessed, not only in terms of their intrinsic value, but also in terms of the value of the services that they provide. In this map that you see on the screen, we have mapped that economic use value and compare that with the distribution of population. The darker the color on the map, the higher the value of critical infrastructure use, and the lower the paler of the color, the lower the value. The scale goes from dark pink, which means high economic value and high population, large population, to pale green, which means low economic value of critical infrastructure and thinner population. In most urban areas, there is an overlap of high economic value of critical infrastructure and high population, which may lead to situations of exposure to system failures that could be transferred to other systems in the functioning of our societies, so cascade effects. And in populations or municipalities with thinner population and high economic value, there is the possibility of some infrastructure hubs affecting the way those municipalities can actually manage the infrastructure assets, leading to a mismatch, potential mismatch between the capabilities, the resources that those municipalities have based on their thinner populations and the great relevance of those infrastructures that are serving not only their local populations, but the broader area. Think about, for example, major infrastructure hubs like power plants, strategic industries, and transport hubs. So this requires a governance that is attentive to the specificities of the different places and the different infrastructure assets. The other perspective we have tried to cover in our report is more related to preparedness in the economic sense. So how far regional economies are actually equipped to embrace change in the future. And we have done this from the perspective of regional innovation systems, looking at the available data, comparing the degree of innovation capacity across regions. The map that you see now on the screen shows the regional innovation scoreboard data for the whole of Europe. And you can easily see which is an indicator that covers more than 23 indicators comparing different areas like education and research infrastructure, research and development, investments, innovation activities, and impacts, and classifies regions in 4 performance groups: emerging innovators, moderate innovators, strong innovators, and innovator leader. All of this, all of the Nordic regions, but one, are classified on this map as being strong innovator or innovator leader, which means that the Nordic region in general is well prepared to embrace change and is well, and the regional innovation systems are functioning well compared to the European norm. However, important challenges exist still, in particular this gap between implementation and innovation, whereas some policy instruments available like innovative regulatory test beds, incentives, economic incentives can help scale up the technological innovations. Their effectiveness is still conditioned by local factors that are spread or distributed unevenly in the Nordic region. And those include long-term policy frameworks that are stable over time, institutional capacity, investment strategies that are well-defined on the business level, and also social acceptance and workforce readiness. And a very good example of this pattern is provided by the green transition and green innovation in particular, that we have tried to capture here from the perspective of green patenting and innovation. These green patents cover specifically sectors like renewable energy, energy efficiency, waste reduction, and carbon capture and storage. So those are the technologies that are covered by this green patenting activity. And as you can see on the map, looking at the normalized values of these green patterns by population, the distribution of patenting activity is distributed very unevenly, but also very broadly in the Nordic region, so that it does not only stem from more urbanized areas, but also you can see huge high patenting activities in areas that are not central in terms of economic roles. However, patenting has some limitations in order to capture innovation capacity, because patenting essentially informs on innovation capacity, inventive capacity, not directly innovation, which is a broader concept. Still, there's a strong association between patenting, research and development investment, and innovation that, assuming that it holds, and looking at this map, suggests that the green region in general is well prepared to embrace and lead the green transition at the European level. That will have important benefits for sectors such as clean energy, advanced manufacturing, sustainable services, etc., that could see an increase of the number of jobs and economic output in those sectors. But it also has challenges related to the adjustment costs in some carbon-intensive sectors, such as energy, manufacturing, transportation, and heavy industry. So also in this case, the alignment between this innovation capacity, technological readiness with other enables is key. In particular, again, policy coherence, infrastructure, institutional strength, and social acceptance are elements that are required in order to enable this transformation. Otherwise, the implementation of the green transition risks fragmentation with different regions and areas benefiting, but also some losers in this process. So wrapping up, I guess that this presentation could be summarized by saying that we live in times of change. It is still premature to say to what extent that change, those shocks that we see are affecting our economies, will lead in directions that are different and look different from the previous growth dynamics. But we see that we have some vulnerabilities, that we have some criticalities that need to be addressed locally. And we also see that we have some potentialities. We have a huge innovation capacity that could be the basis for a societal transformation that yields benefits both for the environment and for societies in different ways. However, I would like to finalize this presentation also by thanking all the contributors that contributed data, visuals, maps, insights, and analysis to this chapter, because this was also a collective effort that needs to be given credit. So thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. A very good overview and constant change, of course. So something that we all need to deal with and solve. We have had a very active chat still with some questions coming up. So I will turn straight to Maria and we'll come back with a question or two to Carlos.
Yes, and I think that the first question that we should take is, are Nordic economies become more dependent on specific sectors or skilled workers?
It's a bit of a tough question in the sense that, as I said before, we were working mostly on preliminary data that were estimates from the European Commission for the economic dynamics. So it is difficult to make bold statements about economic structural transformations in the Nordic region based on this data. However, what we see actually is rather a diversification of sources of growth. So not anymore coming from services, high quality services in cities, but rather more diversified picture with old industrial regions providing new industrial services in different sectors. Defense is clearly one of them, but also many other market segments in the electrification sector provide good examples of emerging sectors or emerging activities that are diversifying growth in many regions.
And while we talk about competitiveness, you've of course looked at it from the economic perspective, but from the corner of my eye, I see Anna nodding when we talk about dependence on certain sectors, because this is something that comes across also in the labor market part. So definitely we do see some patterns across the regions there. Let's take maybe another question to Carlos, still staying on the topic of economy.
And we were also asked to comment a bit more on places. So when we look at the regional growth dynamics, why do some places do better than others? Can it be also said that rural and intermediate regions are the main beneficiaries of the current economic landscape? Any comments?
Do we see winners and losers?
We see partial winners and losers, again, on preliminary data. However, it is very premature to define, to state that certain type of regional profile or regional specialization will benefit more from this transformation than others. What we see is that some sectors are clearly emerging, clearly growing due to the context, but that is not necessarily indicating that that will be the case in the future. Again, it's mostly driven by external factors, not by intrinsic economic dynamics and innovation. So too early to say. It could depend a lot on how far and how long all this uncertainty and difficult, gloomy context internationally lasts.
I think this is definitely a question that we probably will not be able to answer right away, and we might even get different answers depending on who we ask. Now that we are getting close to the end of today's session, I just want to let you know that we've now covered the main parts of the report. We've given you a taste of what you can find in it, and we do encourage you to have a closer look at it and browse it, focusing especially on the topics that are closest to your interest. But now I have a question to you. Now that we've given you a taste of what is in the report and a flavor of where the Nordic region is heading, how could you see yourself using some of this information? If you've already used or read State of the Nordic Region in the past, you can also comment based on your past experience. But especially if you're seeing it for the first time, I would like to see what you might make out of this. And that will be a lead-in for our final reflections. I will ask all of our speakers to come back. I will ask Thomas and Maria, who you saw in the beginning, to join me here. We will bring our researchers back. We will share some of the insights of what we've taken out of all of this work that we've done with the report and the highlights. And I would be really keen to hear a little bit more about what you've taken away from it. I see the poll results coming in. I will give you a little bit more time to give us some input, but already now I see that many of you are planning to use it for food for thought, for analysis and insights, definitely for policy development, strategic planning, something that we're glad to see. Also for cross-regional comparisons and benchmarking, possibly for identifying topics for new research or projects, maybe for teaching or training or awareness raising, maybe within your own organization or institution or with colleagues. And we would also like to know what issues or topics you would like to see us or research address in the future. As said many times today, there's only so much that can be covered in one report, so there will definitely be some work ahead of us, but still staying on the present. And while we let our audience give us a bit more input on their use of the report, coming back to Thomas and Maria, we've now heard some highlights of the different parts. You've gone through the whole report as the editors. What are some of the key takeaways that stand out to you? Did something surprising come up in the process?
Yeah, well, I actually have to say that I was a bit surprised by the economy and the resilience that the Nordic region is showing. Amidst all this turmoil, I was expecting to see something definitely worse than what we're actually seeing. So I think that was the main surprising thing to me.
So things might look gloomy, but there is maybe a silver lining somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at the facts, you look at the statistics, it doesn't look that bad. So,
right. What about you, Maria? Is it similar or something else?
I think it is similar to what Thomas have said, but also some of the things like we know the overall situation and how the landscape looks, but sometimes it was quite surprising to see specific numbers, or especially when we looked in the change over time, like which municipality have grown most, or like other things. So you kind of feel that you know how it looks, but then you see the data and this might surprise you. So on that note, we can encourage people to look at the maps more precisely.
Yes, and I think also the sheer variety of the municipalities and regions, the regional realities, because we were talking about place-based growth and what really makes the region fare better than others. There is no single solution.
No, and I was just going to add that's one of the key things of this report, that to use it as a comparative material. I mean, because you might look at the report from your perspective, your specific country, the region you're working in. But I mean, a great value of this is broadening your horizon, looking at the neighboring countries, what's going on there. And I mean, that will definitely give you a competitive knowledge advantage. So I think that's important too.
Yes, we can definitely all learn something from each other. I would also like to do a quick round with our researchers. Nora, Anna, and Carlos, you've looked at specific topics focused more on demography or labor market or economy specifically, but was there something that really stood out to you, or is there something that you pick up as an interesting highlight from the other parts, something that bears resemblance to the work that you have been doing and will do in the future? Nora, can we start with you?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of overlaps, I think, and we see it. Anna, you got a question about the integration and how we can do better integrating different groups in the labor market. That becomes even more important now with demographic changes. And we talked about how the labor markets are shifting and demands of labor force are shifting. And we can see that the care sector, that seems to be a pretty stable source for employment in the future. So I think there's these interesting links that we can explore, and that also make it really interesting to do further analysis of what policies can we try, how can we work together, what is there to explore. So definitely a lot of good insights from the other sections for us in demography as well.
Excellent. Anna, is that similar to you? Are you also seeing these cross linkages between labor market and the other trends across the Nordic region?
Yes, indeed, I would say. There is a strong connection between demography, what's happening in the labor market, and how the economy is evolving. We see that quite clearly. And also in the labor market chapter, we looked into the links between industrial sectoral concentration, for instance, and how that affects the labor market. When it comes to, Nora talked here about the links between demography and labor market. So very strong connections. But I think what came through to me, perhaps, when I was working with the labor market chapter as the most important, was how important it is to try to sustain the Nordic welfare model, and how we can do that through keeping those employment figures high, how we can also work to support the high productivity, which is really important for reducing vulnerability in different regions, and also the importance of closing the gender gaps. That was I did not mention that in my presentation, but gender segregation and gender gaps are still important in the Nordic region, which is somewhat surprising given all the policies and regulations that we have in that area, and with the high goals that we have for equality in the Nordic region. So those were a few things that came to me.
Thank you, Anna, for adding the gender perspective, because that's something that came up in the chat as well. And we do touch upon it in the report. We just did not have too much time to go into it now, but that is definitely something that we still need to work on at the Nordic level. Carlos, final highlights from you. Economy, turbulence continues, but how are we going to get through it?
Yeah, I think something important that sort of links all these three presentations together is that we are working on different timelines, something that more related to long-term trends, to something that is more dynamic, based on the shocks that I was trying to illustrate earlier, and something in between that is like between these two lines on the labor market level. So all these multi-line, multi-time aspects are important. And also, as far as the economy is involved, I think that based on the evidence that we are collected in the report, something that emerges kind of very strongly is the degree of exposure and vulnerability that we have in relation to the external context, to the global context. How our economies, overall small and open, are reflecting very directly all these external factors. Something to think about, and something to see how we can better sort of plan for in the future.
So as much as we say that we should look at our neighbors and learn from each other, it's also good to remember that Nordic region is part of a bigger world, and we're also influenced by the broader trends. This almost closes our discussion today. I want to leave the final word to our two editors. So any last highlights? What's going to happen next? What are we doing? What do we maybe want from our viewers as the next steps?
Well, of course, we all appreciate that you've attended this workshop or seminar, and we always welcome feedback and collaborations at Nordic. So feel free to reach out to us. Yeah.
Yes, we are here for you, and we would love to continue the discussion. Maria, any wishes from you?
Yeah, also wanted to thank all our audience today, because the chat was active and we got some really interesting questions. We didn't have time to cover them all, but thank you, and we will take them with us. And yeah, it's I know that we are following up with a few themes from the State of the Nordic Region in our projects. So for us, it's also interesting to hear what you think we should maybe dive into as a project later. So again, reach out to us.
Yes, we say that State of the Nordic Region is a conversation starter. There is a lot of topics to pick up in your organization, with your colleagues, with your peers in future projects and so on. And this launch has also been a conversation starter. We hope to keep the conversation going. Thank you for being very active. If you have further feedback, we've launched a poll, and there will be a little survey that pops up once we finish today. And you can, of course, submit more comments to us. So do take a minute or two to share some highlights from your side in the chat. We will definitely pick those up and take those into account in our further work. Now, the final words that I want to share with you is that I just want to remind that the report itself is very heavy on details and information. It covers 10 different chapters for 3 different topics. We do look at different aspects of demography. We look at population change. We look at the projections going towards 2045, and we look at diversity and some of the migration patterns. In terms of labor market, we look at the labor force perspective, the labor market dynamics from a sectoral perspective, as well as the vulnerability and resilience of our labor markets. And when it comes to economy, Carlos shared some highlights. We have looked at how resilient Nordic economies are, but we've also looked at critical infrastructures across the Nordic region and the role of innovation, especially in the context of the green transition. So all of this and more is available in the report. Have a closer look. Find the part that interests you the most and dig deeper. You can access the report online. It is available on our website. We've shared the link in the chat. It is available also as a PDF if you want to download a copy. And you can even get a print copy if you happen to visit Stockholm or our offices, or otherwise are very interested to do reach out to us, and let's keep the conversation going. The final reminder before we close is that you've seen some of our researchers, you've seen our editors today, but State of the Nordic Region builds on all of the work and activities that we do as Nordregion. There is a big team behind this report. It highlights our research capacities, but also our work on GIS, on geospatial analysis, on all of the maps and such, and builds on our Nordic statistics and data analytics capacities. So a big thank you from our entire team to you for taking part in this launch. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you so much, and we hope to hear from you soon.